Let me take you back. Picture a nation torn in two, not just by war, but by its own soul. In the late 1800s, America was a roaring engine, her factories breathing smoke into a sky once clear with promise. We had reached from sea to shining sea, but the ocean's edge felt like a cliff. Should we jump? The debate was a fever in the blood of the country. My own grandfather, Samuel Vance, was a congressman from Ohio, a man of steadfast principle. He would come home at night, his face lined with a worry I was too young to understand. He spoke of men like Secretary of State Walter Thorne, a man with eyes on distant horizons, Greenland, islands in the Caribbean, a world beyond our shores. "It is not our place, Elias," my grandfather would say, his voice firm but edged with fear. "To seize an empire is to chain our soul to 1,000 foreign ghosts. We must tend our own garden." That was the phrase they all used, tend our own garden. It was a powerful idea, a shield against the unknown, and for a time that shield held. Congress, filled with men like my grandfather, said no. Again and again they said no. They feared entanglement. They feared the corruption of distant power. They feared, though they whispered this part, the responsibility of ruling people who did not look or pray like us. We were a continent, but we chose not to be a colossus. That choice felt like safety. It felt like wisdom. But choices have consequences, and the world does not stand still while you tend your garden. A storm was brewing, a storm of steel and steam and ambition, and it would not ask for our permission to arrive on our shores. The turn of the century was a tense, electric time. Power was shifting, flowing away from the halls of Congress and into the hands of a stronger, more centralized government, fueled by the demands of a massive industrial economy. Then came President William Sterling. Where my grandfather saw danger, Sterling saw destiny. And in 1898, he found his catalyst, the island of Cuba, crying out for freedom from a dying Spanish empire. The newspapers screamed with headlines, stories of oppression that stirred the public's heart. But in private letters my grandfather preserved, a different story unfolded. Sterling saw a strategic prize, a key to the Caribbean. The explosion that sank the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, a tragedy wrapped in mystery, was the spark he needed. The cry for war became a roar. I remember the national anguish, the fiery outrage. But I also remember the silence in my grandfather's study. He knew. He knew this was not just about freeing Cuba. This was about stepping onto the world's stage for the first time in boots meant for marching. The war was over in a blink. We were young, strong, and the Spanish Empire was a relic. And when the dust settled, we didn't just have Cuba's gratitude. We had Puerto Rico, we had Guam, we had the distant, sprawling archipelago of the Philippines. We had, almost without realizing the weight of it, an empire. The shield had been shattered, and in that moment, a terrifying question was born. Having taken the first step, could we ever turn back? The world, once so distant, now felt frighteningly close. We annexed Hawaii, a kingdom whose queen I later met, her eyes holding a sorrow for a lost world. We dug the Panama Canal, a ditch that spliced continents and made two oceans one. And then the Great War erupted in Europe. For 3 years we watched from across the Atlantic, horrified but separate. President Woodrow Wilson pleaded for neutrality, but the ocean was no longer a moat. German submarines began targeting our ships, drawing us into the deep, dark water. Our boys sailed across to the trenches of France, and their sacrifice turned the tide. Suddenly, America wasn't just a participant, we were the arbiter. Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference not as a supplicant, but as a prophet. He brought a vision so daring it took my breath away. A League of Nations, a council of all nations to end war forever. I was a junior aide then, carrying dispatches. I saw the hope in the eyes of diplomats from smaller nations. For the first time, someone was offering a system, not just conquest. But when Wilson brought his dream home, he faced a wall. The old ghost of isolationism, now led by a senator named Henry Cabot Lodgett, rose up. My grandfather, old and frail by then, agreed with him. "The world's quarrels are a poison, Elias," he told me. "This league will drag us into every conflict from here to Constantinople." The Senate rejected the treaty. Wilson, broken by the fight, suffered a stroke. America had won the war, but we abandoned the peace. We turned our back on the world we had helped shape. And in the vacuum we left behind, in the resentments festering in Germany, a new and darker shadow began to grow. Our retreat was a mistake that would cost the world everything. The 1930s were a time of inward pain. The Great Depression hollowed us out. We had no energy for the world's problems. Across the oceans, empires of tyranny were rising. The militarists in Japan, the fascists in Italy, and of course, the Nazis in Germany. We saw them, we read the reports, but we told ourselves it was not our fight. The Pacific, however, was now an American lake. Our possessions in the Philippines and Guam were thorns in the side of Japan's expanding empire. Tensions simmered. Diplomats talked in circles. I was stationed in the State Department by then, translating cables from Tokyo that grew colder, more hostile with each passing month. There was a man, a Japanese diplomat named Kenji Sato, with whom I would share occasional, wary cups of tea. In November of 1941, he looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound, chilling regret. "The currents are too strong now, my friend," he said softly. "They sweep us all away." He said no more. A month later, on a quiet Sunday morning, the sky over Pearl Harbor exploded. The shockwave did not just destroy battleships, it shattered the illusion forever. The two vast oceans had failed to protect us. The storm we tried to avoid had hunted us down. In that moment of smoke and fire, a new and terrible resolve was forged. We would not just win this war. We would ensure, with every fiber of our being, that such a storm could never be allowed to gather again. This was the pivot. This was the point of no return. The Second World War was a furnace, and from it, America emerged not just victorious, but transformed. We were the only great power untouched, our factories now the arsenal of a new world order. And we had a weapon of unimaginable power. The atomic bomb. With that power came a burden heavier than any empire. We could not simply go home. The men who shaped what came next were not soldiers, but visionaries and economists. In 1944, while war still raged, they gathered at a quiet resort called Bretton Woods. I was there, a note-taker in the back of the room. Men like Henry Morgenthau and John Maynard Keynes argued not about borders, but about systems, currencies, trade, loans. They were building the bones of the global economy, creating the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Their goal was audacious, to make another Great Depression and thus another World War impossible. Then came the United Nations, born in San Francisco. I remember the hopeful chaos, the dozens of languages swirling under the dome. We were writing a rule book for the planet. But in the midst of this hopeful construction, I felt a deep unease. At every meeting, in every corridor, the Soviet delegation, led by a grim, unyielding man named Vladimir Chenikov, watched us. They applauded our speeches on peace, but their eyes were calculating, suspicious. We were building a world of open trade and collective security. They saw a world of capitalist encirclement. We had won the war together, but standing in that hall, listening to the translators' hushed voices, I knew with absolute certainty the next war had already begun. It would just be fought differently. It was called the Cold War, but there was nothing cold about the fires it ignited in jungles and deserts across the globe. The doctrine was containment. The mission was to stop the spread of Soviet communism everywhere, always. This was the era when my work truly moved into the shadows. NATO was born, a solemn pledge that an attack on one was an attack on all. But the real war was in the gray zones. I remember sitting across from a Shah in Iran, promising support as his secret police silenced dissent. I remember authorizing funds for rebels in the mountains of Afghanistan, men we called freedom fighters, their ideologies a mystery to us. We made pacts with kings in Saudi Arabia for oil and with generals in South Korea for a strategic foothold. Each alliance was a necessary evil, a brick in the wall against Moscow. But each one also tied a knot, a commitment, a debt. We were creating a web, and America was the spider at its center, feeling every tremor. The most terrifying moment came in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world held its breath, hovering on the edge of nuclear annihilation. I was in the White House basement, part of the crisis team. The maps showed missile trajectories fanning out over American cities. The air was thick with sweat and fear. In those endless hours, the full weight of our power and its terrifying fragility became clear. We were not just a nation. We were the keeper of the global balance, and a single misstep could end everything. The crisis passed, but the lesson was seared into me. This system we built was a high-wire act over an abyss, and there was no getting off the wire. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it felt like a miracle. The Soviet Union crumbled, and America stood alone, the sole superpower. There was a profound, intoxicating sense of victory. Some of my colleagues celebrated. "We can finally go home," one said. "The job is done." But others, like me, felt a deeper, more chilling anxiety. The world had not become simple. It had become unstable. The rigid balance of the Cold War was gone. Who would manage the conflicts that would now bubble up? President James Callaway and his successor faced this crossroads. They made the fateful, and I believe correct, decision. The American system would not be dismantled. NATO would not disband, it would expand, welcoming former Soviet states desperate for an anchor. Our alliances with Japan and South Korea would remain, a check on new powers. We were no longer containing communism, we were shepherding a global order. But this created a paradox. To the world, our unmatched power now looked less like protection and more like hegemony. Resentment festered. New threats emerged, not from rival empires, but from shadowy networks and rogue states who saw our presence not as stability, but as oppression. We had won the long struggle, but in doing so, we had made ourselves the target for every grievance, the answer to every problem, the responsible party for every failure. The burden of being the indispensable nation was a lonely and often thankless one. And so we arrive at today, a world of our making, for better and for worse, a world of unprecedented connection and growth, but also of deep fractures and new dangers. For decades, a consensus held in Washington. American leadership, with all its costs and compromises, was the best option for global stability. But consensus can fracture. In recent years, a powerful voice has risen, questioning every single knot we've tied. It argues that our allies take advantage of us, that our wars are endless sinkholes, that the very system we built is a bad deal for America. It is a voice that echoes the ghost of my grandfather, calling us to tend our own garden once more. This is the great reckoning. After 75 years of deep entanglement, can we truly disengage? What happens to the web if the spider leaves? Would the world find a new balance, or would it descend into a chaos of rival powers and unchecked conflicts? I don't have the answer. No one does. I only know what I have seen. The moment we stepped off our continent, we changed history's course. The moment we decided after Pearl Harbor to build and lead a system, we took on a responsibility that cannot be easily abandoned. The American experiment is no longer just within our borders. It is woven into the fate of billions. The question for the next generation is not whether America is a superpower. That fact is written in the treaties, the bases, the currency, the very circuitry of the modern world. The question is, what will we do with this power? Will we steward it, share it, or relinquish it? The choice you make will echo louder than any bomb, and its consequences will shape the next century. The story is not over. The next chapter is yours to write.